She bought a failed farm for $6 at a county auction in Millbrook Valley, where successful farmers with thick wallets stood frozen, watching her bid on what should have been prime Wisconsin dairyland. But nobody else raised their paddle. Isabella Marchetti looked around the small crowd gathered outside the weathered Dane County courthouse on that crisp October morning, expecting anyone, to challenge her bid. The auctioneer's gavel hung suspended in the cool autumn air, trembling slightly in his weathered hand. The Grimwald Farm sat on 220 acres of what had once been the most fertile soil in southeastern Wisconsin, complete with 4 massive dairy barns, 2 grain silos, and a state-of-the-art milking facility that had cost the previous owners nearly $750,000 to install just 5 years earlier. The silence stretched unnaturally long, punctuated only by the distant sound of tractors working healthy fields on neighboring properties. Isabella could smell the rich scent of turned earth and harvested corn carried on the October breeze, yet somehow the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere around the courthouse steps carried a warning. Going once, the auctioneer called, his voice lacking its usual robust confidence. Harold Kimmel had been conducting county auctions for 37 years, and Isabella had never seen him look so uncomfortable while holding his gavel. That's when Isabella noticed something that made her stomach clench with sudden dread. The local farmers, men and women she'd known since childhood, people who never missed an opportunity to acquire more land for their operations, weren't looking at the property listing posted on the courthouse bulletin board. They weren't studying the aerial photographs showing the farm's extensive infrastructure. They weren't even glancing at the legal description that detailed the property's valuable water rights and excellent road access. They were looking directly at her, not with the envy or competitive frustration she'd expected to see, but with something that chilled her to the bone: pity. The kind of deep, sorrowful sympathy usually reserved for funeral parlors and hospital waiting rooms, as if she'd just purchased her own grave instead of making what appeared to be the investment opportunity of a lifetime. Going twice, the auctioneer continued, his voice now barely above a whisper, and an elderly woman named Constance Hartwell stepped closer to Isabella through the crowd. Her gnarled hands clutched a worn leather purse, and she moved with the deliberate care of someone whose bones had seen too many harsh Wisconsin winters. She leaned in close enough that Isabella could smell the faint scent of chamomile tea on her breath. "Child, you don't want that place," Constance whispered urgently, her pale blue eyes darting nervously toward the other farmers. "Trust an old woman who's watched this county change for 8 decades. That land, there's something wrong with that land." But before Isabella could ask what she meant, the gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo off the limestone courthouse walls far longer than physics should have allowed. "Sold to the young lady in the green jacket for $6 and no cents. The crowd began to disperse immediately, much faster than normal, as if they couldn't distance themselves from the courthouse steps quickly enough. But as Isabella approached the county clerk to complete her purchase, She caught fragments of hushed conversations drifting across the autumn air like leaves blown by an invisible wind. Should have told her about what happened to the Grimwald children. Nobody's successfully farmed that soil in nearly a decade. Remember what the state inspectors found in the well water. Poor girl has no idea what she's gotten herself into. The county clerk, a nervous young man named Timothy Brennan, with ink-stained fingers and wire-rimmed glasses that seemed too large for his narrow face, handed Isabella the deed with hands that trembled noticeably. When Isabella asked about the property's recent agricultural history and why such valuable farmland had sold for practically nothing, Timothy simply shook his head and mumbled something about needing to close the office early for a family emergency. That's when Isabella noticed the most unsettling detail of all. Every single person who had attended the auction, perhaps 30 farmers, land developers, and local business owners, was now positioned across the street from the courthouse, but none of them were walking to their pickup trucks, farm equipment, or SUVs to leave. They formed small clusters under the maple trees that lined Main Street, their voices low and urgent, their eyes constantly returning to Isabella as she completed her paperwork. They were waiting to see what she would do next, waiting with the patient, grim anticipation of people who had witnessed this scene before, as if they expected something specific to happen, something that had happened before, possibly multiple times. The 23-minute drive from the Dane County courthouse to the Grimwald Farm took Isabella through some of the most picturesque countryside in southern Wisconsin, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd made a catastrophic mistake. Rolling hills stretched endlessly under a pewter October sky, and the other farms they'd passed showed clear signs of prosperity and careful management. The Henderson dairy operation displayed a neat row of new John Deere equipment lined up beside freshly painted red barns. The Kowalski family's organic vegetable farm bustled with seasonal workers harvesting pumpkins and winter squash for the Halloween market. The Morrison Ranch showed healthy Angus cattle grazing in perfectly maintained pastures, their black coats gleaming in the filtered sunlight. But as Isabella's Honda Pilot approached the Grimwald property, the landscape began to change in ways that made her increasingly uncomfortable. The neighboring farms closest to her new property looked different. Not abandoned exactly, but strangely quiet in a way that felt unnatural for the busy harvest season. The Brennan family farm, which should have been bustling with corn harvesting activity, sat silent with equipment parked haphazardly as if work had been abandoned mid-task. The old Kowalski homestead, not related to the successful organic farmers she'd passed earlier, showed drawn curtains on every window despite the early afternoon sunlight. Most disturbing of all, she counted at least 4 properties that appeared to have been recently evacuated. Houses with furniture still visible through windows, farm equipment left in fields as if operators had simply walked away mid-job, gardens that had been planted in spring but left untended through summer and fall. The Grimwald Farm itself sat at the end of a gravel road called Meadowbrook Lane that hadn't been properly maintained in what appeared to be several years. Potholes filled with stagnant rainwater reflected the overcast sky like dark mirrors, and the road's edges showed signs of erosion that suggested minimal traffic over recent months. As Isabella pulled her vehicle up to the main farmhouse, she immediately understood why the property had failed so completely, and why her $6 bid had gone unchallenged. The house was a substantial 2.5-story structure, probably built in the early 1960s when the Grimwald family had first established their dairy operation. It featured the classic white clapboard siding and green metal roof common to Wisconsin farmhouses, but the paint was peeling in long strips that hung like dead skin, and several of the roof's metal panels showed rust stains that had streaked the siding below. But it was the surrounding land that truly caught Isabella's attention and filled her with growing dread. In a region renowned for producing some of the richest agricultural soil in the Midwest, the Grimwald Farm looked like a moonscape. The fields were covered with scraggly weeds and patches of earth so dark they appeared almost black, as if someone had spread charcoal across what should have been fertile farmland. No crops grew here, despite neighboring farms showing healthy corn stubble and winter wheat plantings. Isabella parked her Honda beside the farmhouse and stepped out onto soil that made a strange crunching sound under her boots, almost like walking on crushed glass mixed with gravel. The ground felt wrong somehow, too firm in some places, too soft in others, as if the earth itself couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. The front door of the farmhouse stood slightly ajar, which seemed odd for a property that had been empty for months according to the auction paperwork. Isabella pushed it open and called out, "Hello, anyone here?" more out of courtesy than any real expectation of an answer. Inside, dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that were surprisingly clean given the exterior's neglected appearance. The air carried a strange smell, not quite decay, but something chemical and unpleasant that made her eyes water and left a metallic taste in her mouth. It reminded her of the science labs from her college chemistry classes, that combination of bleach and something else she couldn't identify. The house had been cleared out of most furniture and personal belongings, but enough remained to tell a disturbing story. In the kitchen, a half-finished crossword puzzle sat on the table next to a pen, as if someone had been interrupted mid-word. Children's artwork was still attached to the refrigerator with magnets, drawings of farm animals and family stick figures that seemed heartbreakingly normal in this increasingly abnormal situation. A coffee mug sat in the kitchen sink with dark residue that suggested it had been abandoned mid-drink. The calendar on the wall still showed March of the previous year, with several appointments circled in red ink: soil testing 9 a.m., EPA meeting 2 p.m., and most ominously, attorney consultation urgent. Isabella walked through the empty rooms, her footsteps echoing on hardwood floors that creaked with age and what sounded like structural stress. In what appeared to be the master bedroom, she discovered something that made her hands shake as she picked it up: a thick manila folder on the nightstand, stuffed with official documents bearing the letterheads of various government agencies. The first document was a letter from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, dated 8 months earlier. "Mr. Grimwald, Following our inspection of your property on March 15th, we have identified significant concerns regarding groundwater contamination on your land. Preliminary testing indicates the presence of industrial chemicals in concentrations that exceed federal safety standards by levels we have rarely encountered in agricultural settings. You are hereby ordered to cease all farming activities immediately and contact our office within 48 hours to discuss emergency remediation procedures. Isabella's hands trembled as she read the second document, this one from the Environmental Protection Agency, Mr. Heinrich Grimwald. This serves as final notice that your property has been classified as a potential Superfund site due to extreme levels of toxic contamination found in soil and groundwater samples. Our investigation indicates systematic illegal dumping of industrial waste over a period of several years. Criminal charges may be pending. All agricultural activities must cease immediately. Human habitation of the premises is strongly discouraged due to health risks. The third document was a handwritten note in what appeared to be Heinrich Grimwald's own writing. They're saying we contaminated our own land, but we never used anything but standard fertilizers and pesticides. The soil was fine when we bought this place 12 years ago. Someone has been dumping chemicals here without our knowledge. The kids are getting sick. Maria has headaches every day now. We have to leave, but where can we go? No one will buy contaminated land. We're losing everything, and no one will tell us who did this to us. Isabella set the documents down with shaking hands, finally understanding why the crowd at the auction had looked at her with such pity. She hadn't bought a farm. She'd bought what amounted to a toxic waste site. The soil was poisoned, the water was contaminated, and based on Heinrich Grimwald's note, his entire family had been forced to abandon their home and livelihood because someone had been using their property as an illegal dumping ground. Determined to understand the full scope of what she'd unknowingly purchased, Isabella decided to explore the property's outbuildings before making any decisions about her next course of action. The first barn, a modest structure that had probably housed dairy cows in the farm's operational days, was empty except for some rusted milking equipment and hay bales that had turned an unnatural black color and gave off a chemical odor that made her gag. The second barn, smaller but more modern, contained what appeared to be abandoned farming implements. A tractor that looked relatively new but wouldn't start, plowing equipment that showed signs of corrosion despite being stored indoors, and dozens of empty chemical containers with labels that had been deliberately removed or rendered illegible. But the third barn, the largest of the four structures and clearly the newest, was secured with heavy chains and multiple padlocks that looked far newer and more sophisticated than anything else on the property. Someone had locked this building recently and thoroughly, using military-grade hardware that seemed wildly excessive for securing farm equipment. Isabella walked around the barn's perimeter, looking for windows or another way to see inside. The building had been constructed without windows, which was unusual for a farm structure, and every possible entry point had been sealed and secured. However, she found a loose board near the back wall, where weather and time had worked one of the siding planks, partly free from its frame. Using a fallen tree branch as a pry bar, Isabella worked the board loose enough to create a gap she could peer through. What she saw inside made her blood run cold and her knees suddenly feel weak. The barn wasn't storing farming equipment. Instead, it was filled with hundreds of metal drums, each roughly the size of a large trash can, stacked in carefully organized rows that reached nearly to the ceiling. Each drum was labeled with chemical symbols, hazard warnings, and identification numbers that Isabella didn't recognize, but knew instinctively meant extreme danger. Industrial waste containers, dozens upon dozens of them, some showing signs of corrosion and leakage that had stained the concrete floor beneath them in patterns that resembled abstract art painted with poison. The air that escaped through the gap she created carried a chemical smell so intense it made her eyes stream and forced her to step back gasping. This wasn't a failed farm, it was an illegal toxic waste disposal operation that had been systematically poisoning the land, the water, and probably the air for years. And now Isabella legally owned 220 acres of contaminated property that someone had been using as their personal environmental crime scene. As Isabella stood there, trying to process the magnitude of what she'd discovered, movement at the edge of her peripheral vision made her turn toward the nearest field. A figure stood at the tree line approximately 200 yards away, watching her through what appeared to be binoculars or a camera with a telephoto lens. Even at that distance, Isabella could tell the person was deliberately using the trees for concealment, positioning themselves to observe without being easily seen. When she raised her hand to shade her eyes for a better look, the figure immediately melted back into the woods with the kind of smooth professional movement that suggested military or law enforcement training. But Isabella had seen enough to know this wasn't a curious neighbor or casual trespasser. The watcher wore dark clothing suitable for surveillance work and had been positioned with a clear view of both the farmhouse and the locked barn. Someone had been monitoring this property, probably for a considerable period of time. The question that made her stomach churn with fear was, were they watching to keep people away from the contamination, or to make sure nobody discovered who was responsible for creating it in the first place? That evening, as Isabella sat in her Honda in the farmhouse driveway, trying to decide whether to drive back to Madison or stay and investigate further, her cell phone rang. The caller ID showed only unknown number. Miss Marchetti, a man's voice calm and professional, with what sounded like a slight southern accent. I understand you've made a very interesting purchase today. Isabella felt her heart rate spike. Who is this? How did you get my number? I represent certain parties who have been monitoring the Grimwald property for quite some time. I'd like to make you a business proposition. What kind of proposition? $75,000, cash, tonight, for the property you purchased this morning. No questions asked, no paperwork complications, just a simple private sale that could make this whole situation disappear. The mathematics were staggering. Isabella had paid $6 for the farm. This mysterious caller was offering to pay more than 12,000 times that amount for land that was supposedly contaminated and worthless. That's quite a markup for poisoned farmland, Isabella said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. Why would anyone pay so much for a toxic waste site? There was a long pause before the voice responded, and when it did, Isabella detected something that might have been amusement. Who told you anything about toxic waste, Miss Marchetti? And more importantly, How would you know what's in that locked barn unless you'd been somewhere you shouldn't have been? The line went dead, leaving Isabella staring at her phone and realizing with growing horror that she'd just revealed to unknown parties that she'd discovered their secret. Whoever was behind the illegal dumping operation now knew that she'd found the evidence, and based on what appeared to have happened to the Grimwald family, and possibly other farmers in the area, that knowledge might just have signed her death warrant. Research and disturbing discoveries rather than staying on the isolated farm property overnight, Isabella drove back to Madison and checked into a Hampton Inn near the university campus. Using the hotel's Wi-Fi and her laptop, she began researching the Grimwald Farm and its recent history, as well as the broader pattern of farm failures and family disappearances she'd begun to notice in Millbrook Valley. What she discovered over the next 4 hours of intensive internet searching was deeply disturbing and suggested something far more sinister than simple environmental contamination. The Grimwald family, Heinrich, Maria, and their 3 children ages 8, 12, and 15, had owned and successfully operated their dairy farm for 14 years before the contamination issues began. Heinrich was a 3rd-generation Wisconsin farmer with an impeccable reputation for sustainable agricultural practices. Maria had been active in local environmental groups and organic farming initiatives. Their children were honor students involved in 4-H and Future Farmers of America. But starting approximately 3 years ago, their farm had begun experiencing mysterious problems. Cattle became sick and died despite veterinary care. Crops failed even in ideal weather conditions. Soil tests revealed chemical contamination that the family insisted they had never used or even seen on their property. They filed complaints with multiple state environmental agencies, demanding investigations into possible illegal dumping. They hired their own environmental consultants and lawyers, spending their life savings trying to prove that someone else was responsible for contaminating their land. But before any meaningful official investigation could begin, the entire Grimwald family simply vanished. According to police reports Isabella found archived in local newspaper websites, their farmhouse was discovered empty on a Thursday morning in late March. The family's vehicles were gone, but most of their personal belongings remained, including clothes, family photographs, and the children's school projects. No forwarding address was left, no contact was made with relatives, friends, or their children's schools. The Dane County Sheriff's Department had classified it as a voluntary missing persons case, suggesting in their final report that the family had simply decided to start over somewhere else, rather than deal with the financial burden of their contaminated farm. But Isabella's research revealed something the sheriff's report hadn't mentioned. The Grimwald family wasn't the first to disappear from farms in Millbrook Valley. Pattern of disappearances over the past 7 years, Isabella discovered at least 6 other farming families in the immediate area had mysteriously abandoned their properties after reporting similar soil and water contamination issues. The Kowalski family, the old homestead, not the successful organic farmers, the Brennans, the Andersons, the O'Briens, the Kowalsiks, and the Morettis had all vanished without a trace after filing environmental complaints. All had been successful farmers before the contamination appeared. All had denied responsibility for the chemicals found on their properties. All had spent their savings trying to prove their innocence and find the real source of the contamination. and all had disappeared before any official investigations could be completed. Most disturbing of all, Isabella found property records showing that all of these abandoned farms had later been quietly sold at county auctions for nominal fees, usually less than $20 each. And according to corporate filing records she found in the Wisconsin Secretary of State database, all of those farms were now owned by shell companies with Madison addresses that, when she looked them up on Google Street View, led to empty office buildings or businesses that appeared to exist only on paper. Someone was running a systematic operation to contaminate family farms with illegal toxic waste dumping, drive the families away through environmental health concerns and financial ruin, then acquire their valuable agricultural property for practically nothing through rigged county auctions. The question was who had the resources and connections to carry out such an elaborate scheme, and how far would they go to protect their operation from exposure. The warning the next morning, Isabella found something that made her hands shake as she walked out of the Hampton Inn toward her car. Tucked under her Honda's windshield wiper was a handwritten note on expensive-looking letterhead. "Miss Marchetti, you seem like an intelligent woman who made an innocent mistake. Accept our generous offer of $75,000, leave Wisconsin, find a new place to start your life. Some secrets are more dangerous than they are valuable. Some secrets have already cost several families everything they held dear. Don't become another tragic story in Millbrook Valley's recent history. A concerned friend." Isabella crumpled the note, but immediately smoothed it out again and took several photographs of it with her phone camera. Someone was definitely watching her movements, and they were escalating from financial offers to barely veiled threats. She had a choice to make: take the money and run like so many others apparently had, or stay and fight for justice for the Grimwald family and all the other farmers who had been driven from their land by this criminal conspiracy. But as she sat in her Honda in the hotel parking lot, Isabella thought about the children's drawings still attached to the refrigerator in that empty farmhouse. Somewhere those Grimwald children were wondering why they couldn't go home, why they'd had to leave their friends and school and pets behind. Their parents were probably working minimum wage jobs in some distant city, having lost everything they'd spent a lifetime building. That decided it for her. Isabella Marchetti might have only paid $6 for that farm, but she was going to make sure she got her money's worth in justice, even if it killed her, which, based on the pattern of disappearances in Millbrook Valley, was becoming an increasingly real possibility.
Previously, Isabella Marchetti bought the Grimwald Farm for $6 and discovered it was being used as an illegal toxic waste dump. After finding evidence that multiple farming families had mysteriously disappeared after reporting contamination, she received a threatening note offering $75,000 to leave Wisconsin. Isabella made her decision before she'd even finished reading the threatening note. She wasn't running. Too many families had already been driven away, or worse, and someone needed to stand up to whoever was behind this systematic destruction of Millbrook Valley's farming community. She drove straight back to the Grimwald Farm, this time bringing a digital camera and sample containers. As she pulled up to the farmhouse, she immediately noticed something that hadn't been there the day before: fresh tire tracks in the gravel driveway, and the front door now had a new deadbolt lock installed. Someone had been here overnight. Following the sound of machinery, Isabella discovered two men in hazmat suits operating industrial pumping equipment
near the contaminated fields. They were extracting dark, oily liquid through transparent hoses into an unmarked tanker truck. Isabella crouched behind a storage shed and photographed the operation, but as she shifted position, her foot crunched on a fallen branch. Both men stopped working immediately and turned in her direction. She'd been spotted. Before Isabella could reach her Honda, a black SUV emerged from behind the barn and blocked her path. Two men in business suits got out, moving with the bearing of security personnel. "Miss Marchetti," the taller man called out, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "We need to talk. As of this morning, this property has been seized by the Environmental Protection Agency. You no longer have legal access to this site." But Isabella knew real EPA agents wouldn't be working with unmarked tanker trucks to remove evidence in the middle of the night. These men were not government agents. The escape and discovery. Isabella sprinted toward the back of the property, where a dirt road led to the neighboring Henderson farm. Behind her she heard the SUV starting, but the rough terrain gave her enough advantage to reach safety. Margaret Henderson, who had been farming in Millbrook Valley for 38 years, welcomed Isabella into her kitchen. Over coffee, Margaret confirmed Isabella's worst fears. The systematic contamination and family disappearances had been an open secret for years. The families that disappeared all tried to fight back, Margaret explained. They hired lawyers, contacted environmental groups, filed complaints, and then one day they were just gone. That evening, Margaret contacted her brother-in-law David, a truck driver who had been keeping quiet about something he'd witnessed. David arrived after dark with photographs and shipping documents that revealed everything. "I thought it was fertilizer," David explained, spreading documents across Margaret's kitchen table. "But we were hauling drums marked with chemical symbols to farms in the valley, always at night, always to locations where no one would see us." The shipping record showed systematic deliveries to all the farms where families had later disappeared. The company name on the documents was Heartland Agricultural Solutions, with connections to Blackstone Protective Services, the same security firm that had confronted Isabella. Using Margaret's computer, Isabella researched the corporate connections. Heartland was owned by Midwest Development Corporation, which was controlled by Meridian Holdings, a company specializing in acquiring agricultural land for suburban development. The pattern became clear: systematically contaminate family farms, drive owners away through environmental crises, acquire the land for nothing at county auctions, then develop profitable suburban housing after minimal cleanup. Isabella discovered that Meridian had submitted proposals for Millbrook Estates, a luxury development planned for the exact properties where families had disappeared. The Grimwald Farm was slated to become a golf course surrounded by million-dollar homes. The final gambit. At 3:17 a.m., Isabella's phone rang, the same southern voice, but now with an edge of irritation. "Miss Marchetti, you've had a busy day. Your property rights ended when you became a fugitive from federal custody. We have security footage of you assaulting EPA personnel and stealing classified documents." Isabella realized they were framing her. "I never assaulted anyone. That's not what our witnesses will testify. Unless you accept our revised offer, $100,000 and a clean record, or you can fight charges for assaulting federal agents and interfering with environmental cleanup. I'll need time to think about it. You have until tomorrow night." Instead of running or accepting their offer, Isabella decided to turn their tactics against them. Working with Margaret and David, she spent the morning copying every document and uploading them to cloud storage accounts. Then she made simultaneous calls to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, Wisconsin Public Radio, the EPA's Inspector General, and the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. But Isabella's masterstroke was calling Meridian Holdings directly and speaking with CEO Richard Blackwood. "I understand you've been having difficulties with your property purchase," Blackwood said smoothly. "I'm prepared to offer $250,000 plus relocation assistance." "You mean like you did for the Grimwald family?" Isabella replied. "I have shipping records showing chemical deliveries to every farm where families disappeared. Corporate documents linking Heartland, Blackstone and Meridian. Photographs of your illegal dumping operation. What do you want? Justice for the families you've destroyed, full environmental cleanup, and criminal prosecution for everyone involved." Blackwood laughed coldly. "You're one person against a multi-billion-dollar corporation with government connections. You can't win this fight. Watch me." Isabella hung up and immediately sent all evidence to every news outlet and environmental group she could find. Then she posted everything on social media with #MillbrookTruth. Within hours, the story had gone viral. #Justice served. The investigation that followed was swift and comprehensive. Federal agents raided Meridian Holdings, Heartland Agricultural Solutions, and Blackstone Protective Services simultaneously. Richard Blackwood and 14 conspirators were arrested on charges including environmental terrorism, racketeering, fraud and conspiracy. The missing families were located through a witness protection program that Blackwood had been funding, not to protect them but to ensure their silence. The Grimwald family was reunited with their farm after complete environmental cleanup, funded by Meridian's seized assets. Isabella's $6 investment became the foundation for the largest environmental justice settlement in Wisconsin history. Every contaminated farm was restored, every displaced family was compensated, and new federal laws were enacted to prevent similar conspiracies. Most importantly, Isabella discovered something about herself, that sometimes the most valuable things can't be measured in dollars, but in the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. The $6 farm had been the best investment she'd ever made, not because of the land, but because it revealed who she truly was when justice was on the line. End of story. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of one woman's fight against corporate environmental crime. If you enjoyed this story of courage and justice, please like and subscribe for more amazing tales of ordinary people who chose to do the right thing when it mattered most.